covenant that we signed with the Lord was not fit for our salvation because it had a requirement of us. And we were all broke. We'd already broken that covenant. We need a new one. If we're going to have a new covenant, that means we need somebody with the authority to author it. So there was the matter of the law. There was also the matter of the covenant. In the Old Testament, when they sacrificed animals at the temple, it's important to remember those animal sacrifices did nothing to atone for your sin. The reason why God commanded the people to kill animals was to remind them of the gravity of their sin. But an animal's blood cannot take on your sin for you. You had to shed your own blood to atone for your own sins. Those animal sacrifices were meant to remind. And so if you and I were to be saved, there had to be a blood sacrifice by a man, a human. So Christ had to become flesh and blood for that flesh to be broken and for that blood to be shed. Do you understand? There's also the matter of kingship. God, when he established his people on earth, remember, he was the leader of them. And there's the very famous passage in the Old Testament where the people demanded a king. And God gave them their demand, and it led them inexorably to exile. But here in Christ, there's this throne in Jerusalem. There's the throne of God's people, and God wanted that throne again. And so there had to be a man to come and sit on that throne, to be king. That takes establishment. And of course, there is the whole matter of sacrifice in the first place, that blood atonement. So for all these reasons and more, Christ had to be established for the church. Now I want you to meditate for just a minute. And then perhaps later on this afternoon and throughout this week, I want you to meditate on the incredible sacrifice that was both God the Father's and Christ the Son's in being established here on earth. Because in Christ's establishment, God the Father lost a son in heaven. Okay? One that he gave over for destruction. And for Christ the Son, it's a great humiliation, as we read in Philippians 2. It's a great humiliation for him to become man and to be subject to all the ramifications and consequences of a fallen world. He has to cry. He has to suffer. He has to bleed and hurt. Not because of his own sin, but because of our sin in a world that we created, which we messed up. He essentially joined us in our misery. Okay? It's an incredible sacrifice. Here on earth, if a king's coronation is a wonderful time of celebration and feasting. If you ever watch a coronation in England or a coronation in another country where there's a monarchy, when that king is crowned, it's a huge moment of celebration and feasting, and that king is made merry. But think about Christ's coronation. He was enthroned in a cattle trough, and he was crowned with thorns. Okay? It was a humiliating, difficult coronation for our king. And we do well to meditate on it, to think about it, because it only engenders in me a desire to be a better subject. Our king, never forget that our king is a servant king. He serves. He came to serve. He came to lay down his life. And so if you want to pay homage or to serve a servant king, you do it by laying down your life as well. Well, the next thing we note in this single verse is that he was not only established for the church, but that he was also marked for the church. Look at the first part of the verse. It says, "And when 8 days were completed before his circumcision," and I want to focus for just a moment here on his circumcision, that marking that he took. It's very important that Jesus Christ be born a Jew. Okay? It's very important that Christ be born a Jew. God began his reconciliation with mankind through Abraham. Do you remember that? God decided that he was going to build a kingdom here on earth. And he began by calling Abraham out of his town and made him a pilgrim to look for that city whose builder and architect was himself, the Lord. And he wanted to establish through Abraham and his people a kingdom wherein he would dwell and wherein those people would come to know him and all the world would come to know him. And so it's important that if God covenanted with Abraham, and remember the sign of the covenant for Abraham was that he had to cut off his foreskin. Now that process, circumcision, is a very private thing. It's something that cannot be seen. I mean, it was something which was known only to the Lord. But it's something that God required of Abraham and required of all the men in Israel. Now, of course, a woman cannot be circumcised. But in that society and in God's mind, that circumcision was federal, meaning that it carried over to the women in the household as well. But this was a private marking. Remember that when we're born into this place, we are the product of Satan. We are owned by him. This is his world. We are his people in his cities, in his schools, so to speak. But what God is asking is that we come out from the world, come out from Babylon, and be marked for him. That's what Abraham had to do, to be branded for him, to be circumcised. Okay. Now, this is similar to me, Christ being circumcised is him basically becoming bound to that covenant that Abraham made with God, to be a part of this people. If this is the means by which God employed to reconcile mankind unto himself, then it's important that Jesus be born into that covenant. It's a little similar to me to his baptism. When Jesus comes out of the hills at 30 years old and is baptized by John the Baptist, Jesus had no need of being baptized. We understand that. He didn't need to become a new creation. But what he was doing in his baptism was laying down his life. He was giving over control of himself to God. And that's in essence what his parents are doing for him here by having him circumcised. He's becoming part of that body. Okay? Now, why is this important? Okay, that's the question every preacher has to answer, of course. Why is it important that Christ was circumcised? Well, there's two reasons why it's important. The first is that it shows to you and to me that Christ, by being marked, by being branded, by being circumcised, that Christ was being bound to the people of Israel. Okay? Like a groom making a vow to his bride. And this is important to you and to me because you need to understand that Satan's temptation to Christ in the wilderness was very real. Do you remember when Satan tempted Christ in the wilderness? And he tempted him with power and worlds and all those other things? Well, remember, that's one of the few times when Satan wasn't lying. Okay? Those worlds were Satan's to give. That power was Satan's to give. Those promises were very real. But what we understand about Christ was that he was already bound to an eternal kingdom. And he had already forsaken, because of his joining into the covenant, any claim on Babylon, on the world. And he'd given up on that. And so he was bound. He stepped into the boat, so to speak. He joined us in this singular cause. He became a citizen for eternity in Jerusalem. Okay. The second reason why this is important is that if you then wish to follow Christ, you too must be marked. You too must be branded. You too must be circumcised. Okay. So I have to ask you the question. If you want to be part of this family, if you want to be part of this kingdom, have you been circumcised? Have you been marked? Have you been branded as Christ was? I want to read to you two different passages this time. Turn first to Philippians again. Turn back to Philippians chapter 3. I'm going to read you two passages that Paul explains this idea more of what circumcision is today for you and for me. The first one is Philippians chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Okay? So if you found that, and I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible. Philippians chapter 3, verse 1 reads like this. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things again is no trouble to me, and it is a safeguard for you. Beware of the dogs. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of the false circumcision. For we are the true circumcision, who worship in the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh. Although I myself might have confidence even in the flesh, if anyone has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more. I was circumcised